"You're not my wife anymore. You're just a woman who overstayed her welcome." Grant Mercer said it loud enough for every person in that penthouse to hear: his lawyers, his staff, and the 26-year-old wearing Eleanor's cashmere cardigan, like she'd already signed the lease on this life. Then he grabbed Eleanor's hand, pressed a black trash bag into her palm, and looked directly at her 7-month pregnant belly without a single flicker of shame. "Pack what you earned. Leave everything else." 6 years, his child growing inside her, and he was billing her out like an expired contract. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, please subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The trash bag was black, heavy duty, the kind you use for yard waste or construction debris, the kind no human being should ever hand to another human being and call it a solution. Grant Mercer held it out with 2 fingers, like even touching it was beneath him, and he looked at Eleanor with eyes she no longer recognized. They were flat, decided, done. "Pack what's yours," he said, "and only what you actually earned." Eleanor Hayes stood in the middle of the living room of the penthouse she had kept clean, warm, and alive for 6 years. She was 7 months pregnant. Her feet were swollen. Her back had been aching since Tuesday. And her husband, the man who had once held her face in both hands at their wedding and whispered that she was the only solid thing in his entire world, was holding out a trash bag like she was something to be discarded before the cleaning crew arrived. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't collapse. She just stood there. And something inside her went very, very still. "Grant," she said, and even she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "What is this?" He set the bag down on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo across the whole apartment. Behind him, on the cream sectional sofa that Eleanor had picked out herself from a showroom in Tribeca, sat a woman Eleanor had seen exactly 3 times before. Tessa Vale, 26 years old, a social media personality with 200,000 followers and a habit of laughing at things that weren't funny. She was wearing Eleanor's cardigan, the soft gray one with the pearl buttons that Eleanor had bought on a trip to Edinburgh before the pregnancy, before the exhaustion, before all of this. She was wearing it like it already belonged to her, like she had already moved in, like Eleanor was the guest. "You know what this is?" Grant said, and his voice had that particular tone she'd come to dread controlled corporate, slightly bored, the voice he used in board meetings when someone brought up a proposal he'd already decided to reject. "We've been over this." "We have not been over this," Eleanor said. "We have never once been over anything even close to this." Tessa shifted on the sofa. She uncrossed her legs and then crossed them again. She had the expression of someone watching a mildly interesting documentary, not invested, just present. "Eleanor?" Grant picked up his phone, glanced at it, set it face down on the kitchen counter. Even now, even in this moment, he couldn't give her his full attention. "I need you to be reasonable." "Reasonable," she repeated. "This isn't working. It hasn't been working for a long time. You know that." "I know that I am 7 months pregnant with your child," she said. "I know that I have been in this apartment building, this life, supporting your career for 6 years. I know that I gave up my graduate program at Columbia because you said you needed me focused on us. I know those things, Grant. So tell me what I'm missing." He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable for exactly 4 seconds. She counted. Then he straightened his jaw and became that man again, the one who had learned how to turn human inconvenience into a line item. "You're not," he paused, "you're not suitable for the future I'm building." The words landed like something dropped from a great height. Not suitable. 6 years. A child growing inside her. Not suitable. "I beg your pardon," she said softly. He gestured vaguely in Tessa's direction. "Tessa understands what I need right now. She moves in the right circles. She has visibility. She's 26, Eleanor said. "This isn't about age. Then what is it about? Say it clearly, Grant. Look at me and say it clearly." He looked at her, and he said it. "She's an upgrade, Eleanor. She fits where you don't anymore. You became comfortable, invisible. I need someone who can stand beside me in rooms that matter, and you stopped being that person a long time ago." The room was silent. Somewhere in the city outside, 40 stories below them, life continued as normal. Cabs honked. Delivery bikes threaded through crosswalks. Someone's dog barked twice. Tessa Vale said nothing. She just reached into the pocket of Eleanor's cardigan and pulled out a chapstick. Eleanor looked at the trash bag on the floor. She looked at her husband. She looked at the woman sitting on her sofa in her cardigan, applying chapstick with the calm energy of someone who had already won a game Eleanor hadn't realized she was playing. And then she walked to the bedroom to pack. She did not cry in the bedroom. She would not give the walls the satisfaction. She moved methodically, opened the top drawer of her nightstand, her grandmother's watch, a photograph of herself at age 9 standing in front of a garden she barely remembered, a small navy envelope she'd been carrying for 3 years without opening because her grandmother had said specifically firmly in that no-nonsense voice that brooked no argument, "Not until you need it, Ellie. You'll know when." Eleanor picked up the envelope and held it. Not yet. Not here. Not in this room that smelled like his cologne and her regret. She put it in the inner pocket of her coat, the good coat, the long wool one in charcoal gray that she'd bought herself with her own money before she'd stopped having her own money. She took the photograph, she took the watch, she took the prenatal vitamins from the bathroom and the one novel she was halfway through, and the small framed cross-stitch her mother had made when Eleanor was born, 36 years old, hanging in every home Eleanor had ever had stitched, in blue and cream thread. She is clothed in strength and dignity. She looked at it for a moment, then she put it in the coat pocket too. She didn't take much else. She could have raged through the apartment claiming things making noise. She could have taken the jewelry, some of which, if she were being honest, had been bought with money that was technically from her family's accounts, though she'd never tracked it that way. She could have made this ugly. She walked back out to the living room with a coat, a purse, and her dignity, and she left the trash bag exactly where he'd put it. "That's it?" Grant asked, and to his credit, or perhaps to his shame, he looked slightly surprised. "That's it," she said. Tessa looked up from her phone for the first time. Eleanor looked at her, not with hatred, not with tears, with the particular look of a woman who has just understood something enormous that she doesn't yet have the words for. "Take care of the cardigan," Eleanor said. "It's cashmere." And she walked to the elevator. Ciao. The elevator took 42 seconds to reach the lobby. Eleanor counted those too. The lobby of the Mercer penthouse tower was all glass and travertine, with a security desk staffed by a young man named Dennis, who had always called her Mrs. Mercer, and once during a blizzard 2 winters ago walked 3 blocks to get her hot soup from a diner because she'd been too sick to go herself. Dennis was not at the desk. Instead, there were 2 men in suits she didn't recognize standing near the revolving door. They had the particular posture of people who are about to perform an unpleasant professional task. One of them stepped forward as she crossed the lobby. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He had a document in his hands. "Ms. Hayes," she said automatically. He blinked. "Pardon. I go by Hayes. I always have. What is this?" He held out the document with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly and had learned not to make eye contact during it. "Formal notice of your residency at this address has been formally concluded as of today's date. You are hereby—" "Is this an eviction notice?" Eleanor said. It was not a question. "It's a notice of— It's an eviction notice." She took the paper, looked at it. Neat legal formatting, correct address dated that morning. "He filed this morning." The notice was filed at 9:14 a.m. She'd made him breakfast at 8:45, scrambled eggs with chives because that's what he'd asked for. She'd been standing at the stove 7 months pregnant, making scrambled eggs while he was already an hour into the process of legally removing her from their home. "I see," she said. She folded the notice in half, folded it again, put it in her purse next to the navy envelope. She walked past the suited men, through the revolving door, into the October air, and she stopped on the sidewalk outside the building she'd called home for 4 years and breathed. In, out. The city moved around her like it always had, indifferent, loud, alive. She put her hand on her stomach, a habit now, something she did without thinking the way you'd rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you loved, and she felt her daughter shift and settle. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She started walking. She went to the only place she could think of, a small coffee shop on West 74th called Perch, where she and her friend Margot had been meeting for Sunday brunch for the better part of a decade. It wasn't open on Mondays, but she knew the owner, a compact, fierce Greek woman named Dina, who appeared at the side door within 3 minutes of Eleanor's text. Dina took one look at her, the coat, the purse, the absolutely composed expression that Eleanor was wearing like armor, and said, "Inside, now. Don't argue with me." Eleanor didn't argue. Dina sat her down at the small table by the window and disappeared into the kitchen. She came back with hot chamomile tea, a plate of lucumades, and an expression that suggested she was already prepared to cause harm on Eleanor's behalf. "Tell me," Dina said. So Eleanor told her. All of it. The trash bag, the eviction notice, Tessa Vale, and the Edinburgh cardigan. She told it in the same controlled level voice she'd used in the lobby, but halfway through, somewhere around the part about the scrambled eggs, her voice cracked once. Just once. A single fracture. Then she closed it again. Dina sat across from her and listened without interrupting, which was for Dina an extraordinary act of love. When Eleanor finished, Dina said, "You need a lawyer?" "I know." "You need a place to stay." "I know that too." "You can stay here. The apartment above the shop has been empty since—" "Dina." Eleanor shook her head. "I appreciate it, I do. But there's something I need to do first." She reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the navy envelope. She pulled it out and set it on the table. It was unremarkable to look at. Business-sized, sealed with a plain gold sticker. Her name was written on the front in her grandmother's handwriting, that precise slanted cursive that Eleanor had grown up associating with birthday cards and Christmas letters and report card responses that managed to be both encouraging and clarifying at the same time. Eleanor Hayes, not yet. "What is that?" Dina asked. "My grandmother left it for me, 3 years ago when she died. She told me not to open it until I needed it." She ran her thumb along the sealed edge. "She said I'd know when." "And you know—" Eleanor looked out the window at the street. A woman walked past with a stroller. A man in a yellow jacket was on his phone laughing at something. A pigeon investigated a pretzel on the curb with tremendous seriousness. "I know," Eleanor said. She broke the seal. Inside the envelope, there were 3 things. The first was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting, 3 pages long, written on cream stationery with a small printed monogram at the top, MJH, Margaret Jean Hartwell. The second was a folded legal document, dense with formal language and reference numbers that Eleanor could only partially parse on first reading. The third was a business card, cream stock navy print, 2 lines only, Vivian Cross Esquire, Hartwell Urban Trust. Eleanor read the letter first. She read it slowly, the way you read something that changes every sentence as you go, because every sentence reveals that the previous one meant more than you thought. Her grandmother had written it in the weeks before she died, apparently, though her hand was still steady, and her mind characteristically was absolutely clear. "My darling Eleanor," she began. "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong enough that you finally needed to look for the door I've been keeping open for you. I'm sorry it took pain to get you here, but I want you to know it was always here. The door was always open. Let me explain something I should have told you years ago but didn't, because you were building something you believed in, and I didn't want my interference to change the architecture of your choices. That was my mistake, and I own it fully. Your grandfather built this city, Ellie. Not its skyline, not its landmarks, its bones. The trust he established, which I have maintained, which I have grown, which I have kept quiet and powerful, and waiting controls more of this city than most people will ever know. I am its sole trustee, or I was. As of the date of my death, that role passes to one person and one person only, you. You are the controlling trustee of the Hartwell Urban Trust. You have been in succession since the moment I drew my last breath. The properties are listed in the enclosed documents, and they are, I think if you study them closely enough, going to answer some questions you didn't even know you had. Vivian Cross knows everything. Call her. She's been waiting for you. I love you beyond the reach of any will or legal document or human vocabulary. You are the best of everything your grandfather and I ever tried to build. Be careful, my darling. Be patient. And when the time comes, be extraordinary. With all my love, Grandma Maggie Eleanor set the letter down. She picked up the legal document. She unfolded it. 3 pages. Property addresses listed in column format. Dozens of them. She recognized the neighborhoods. Of course she did. She'd lived in this city her entire adult life. She started reading the addresses. Her eyes moved down the page and stopped. One particular address was listed about a third of the way down. Property designation residential, classification penthouse and tower, status managed long-term commercial lease. The address was her address, the address she had just been evicted from. She read it 3 times. Then she read the one below it. A commercial tower on Park Avenue that she happened to know housed the headquarters of Mercer Capital Grant's firm. Below that, a mixed-use development in Midtown that she happened to know Grant had cited in every major interview of the last 4 years as the keystone asset of his entire financial empire. She turned the page. Another property, and another, and another. 14 addresses in total that she recognized from 6 years of watching her husband describe his success. 14 properties he'd referenced, invested from built toward leveraged against, and every single one of them was in this document. Every single one of them was Hartwell Urban Trust property, her grandmother's property, her property. The man who had handed her a trash bag this morning was living, working, and building his entire empire on a foundation of land that belonged to her. He had thrown her out of her own building. The silence in the coffee shop was very complete. Dina, who had been pretending to wipe down the counter nearby with tremendous concentration, looked over. "Ellie," she said carefully, "your face is doing something that's worrying me." Eleanor looked up. She thought about the trash bag. She thought about the eviction notice. She thought about Tessa Vale in her cashmere cardigan applying chapstick like she'd already won. She thought about scrambled eggs made at 8:45 while a legal notice was being filed. She thought about not suitable. She thought about upgrade. And then for the first time since she'd walked out of the penthouse elevator that morning, Eleanor Hayes smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the smile of a woman who had been comforted or reassured. It was something older than that, quieter. The smile of a woman who has just discovered that the game she thought she was losing is not in fact the game being played. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She found the business card, cream stock, navy print, Vivian Cross Esquire. She dialed. The phone rang twice. Then a voice composed professional, with the particular quality of someone who has spent decades in rooms that required complete composure, said Vivian Cross. "Ms. Cross," Eleanor said. "My name is Eleanor Hayes. Margaret Hartwell was my grandmother. I just opened her letter." A brief silence. Then in a tone that held something Eleanor couldn't quite name, relief perhaps, or the satisfaction of something long waited for finally arriving. "Ms. Hayes," Vivian Cross said, "I've been expecting your call. Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm in a coffee shop on West 74th, Eleanor said. "Good. Stay there. I'll come to you." A pause. "And Ms. Hayes, don't speak to anyone else about this yet. Not anyone, including the people you trust." "Understood." "I'm 40 minutes away." "Miss Cross," Eleanor said before the woman could hang up, "can I ask you something first?" "Of course." Eleanor looked down at the document in her hands, at the addresses, at Grant's building, at Grant's headquarters, at the entire architecture of Grant's success balanced. It turned out on a foundation that had always belonged to her. "Did my grandmother know?" she asked. "Did she know what my husband was doing?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Your grandmother," Vivian Cross said carefully, "was an extraordinarily perceptive woman. She built and maintained one of the most powerful private trusts in this city's history without anyone in the financial community ever fully understanding what they were dealing with. She saw people very clearly." "That's not an answer." "No," Vivian Cross said. "It isn't. I'll explain everything when I get there. 40 minutes, Ms. Hayes." The call ended. Eleanor set her phone on the table. Dina was standing still now, not even pretending to clean anything, watching Eleanor with an expression that fell somewhere between concern and fascination. "What is happening?" Dina said. Eleanor folded the legal document back carefully, put it and the letter and the business card back in the navy envelope, tucked the envelope into her coat pocket, pressed her hand flat against the wool for a moment, feeling its weight. She looked up at her oldest friend. "Do you have any more of those Luku maids?" she asked. Dina blinked. "Yes." "Good," Eleanor said, "because someone is coming to meet me in 40 minutes, and I'm going to need to think clearly, and I think better when I've eaten." She reached for her tea. Her hand was steady. Completely, utterly steady. Vivian Cross arrived in 37 minutes, which Eleanor noted because she was someone who paid attention to what people said and what they actually did, and this particular person had promised 40 minutes and arrived early. That told her something. She was in her early 60s, trim in a perfectly cut charcoal suit, with a silk blouse the color of old amber. She had the kind of silver hair that looked intentional rather than resigned to, and she walked through the door of Perch Coffee Shop like she'd been inside 100 coffee shops that didn't expect her and had made all of them exactly as she required. She saw Eleanor immediately. She sat down across from her without being invited, which Eleanor respected, ordered nothing from Dina's hovering offer, and placed a leather portfolio on the table between them. "You look like your grandmother," Vivian said. "Same way of holding yourself." "People say that," Eleanor said. "It's true." Vivian opened the portfolio. "How much of the document did you read?" "All of it, several times." "Good. Then you understand the scope." "I understand the addresses," Eleanor said. "I want to understand the legal structure. The Hartwell Urban Trust was established in 1962 by your grandfather, Raymond Hartwell, as a private, irrevocable trust. Over 60 years through quiet acquisition, your grandmother grew the property portfolio to its current state. The trust has never sought public recognition. It has never been involved in litigation. It has operated entirely below the radar of the financial press, which was, a brief, precise pause, intentional. "How large is it?" Vivian met her eyes. She said a number. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's," she started. "Yes," Vivian said simply. "And Grant's company, Mercer Capital, his building, the properties he's been leasing," Vivian said. "Long-term commercial leases managed through a series of holding companies that obscure the ultimate ownership. Your husband has never known who his landlord is." She paused. "Until very recently, neither did you. He signed leases with my grandmother's trust." "With representatives of the trust, yes. And now the trust is mine." "The trust is yours," Vivian confirmed. "As of the moment your grandmother died, you became the controlling trustee. I have been acting in a custodial capacity as directed, awaiting your contact." Eleanor thought about this for a moment. "He threw me out of a building I own," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Vivian answered it anyway. "The penthouse at that address is leased to a residential management company that sublets to Yes, your husband. Your husband is a subtenant of your trust." The tick of a clock somewhere in the coffee shop, the hiss of a steamer Dina was pointedly operating at the far end of the counter. "What are my options?" Eleanor asked. Vivian Cross looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted very slightly in her expression. The professional composure didn't break, it simply made room for something warmer, something almost admiring. "Your options," she said, "are considerable." Eleanor put both hands flat on the table. "Then let's start," she said, "from the beginning." They talked for 3 hours. By the end, Eleanor's tea had gone cold twice and been replaced twice. Dina had given up pretending to work and was sitting at the far end of the counter, reading a magazine positioned at the exact angle that would allow her to watch the door and the table simultaneously. By the end, Eleanor had a clearer picture than she'd had of anything in years. By the end, she understood that her grandmother had built something extraordinary and quiet, and that it had been waiting for her patiently, the way all extraordinary things wait without impatience, without announcement, with absolute certainty that the right moment would arrive. By the end, she understood something else, too. She understood why her grandmother hadn't told her. Not because she didn't trust her. Not because she thought Eleanor was too fragile or too young or too distracted by love. Because Maggie Hartwell had known with the particular clarity of someone who has watched people for 86 years that power lands differently in the hands of a person who has had to survive something. That a woman who has been handed a trash bag and walked out of her own building understands in her bones what property means, and what security means, and what dignity means in a way that a woman who'd inherited it at 22 never could. She'd waited for Eleanor to need it, because she'd known Eleanor would know what to do with it. When Vivian finally stood to go, she held out her hand. Eleanor shook it. "What do we do first?" Eleanor asked. "First," Vivian said, "we send a letter." "What kind of letter?" Vivian Cross allowed herself a very small, very precise smile. "The kind," she said, "that makes very large problems feel suddenly very small." She left. Eleanor sat alone at the table for a moment, hand on her stomach, daughter shifting and settling that familiar weight. She picked up the navy envelope one more time. She looked at her grandmother's handwriting on the front. Eleanor Hayes. Not yet. Okay, Grandma, she said quietly. Now. She put the envelope back in her pocket. She picked up her coat. She thanked Dina, who grabbed her arm and held it for a moment without saying anything, which said everything, and she walked out into the October air. This time she didn't stop on the sidewalk. She kept walking, and she didn't look back. Vivian Cross had said, "Send a letter." But before any letter could be sent, Eleanor needed one thing. She didn't currently have a place to sleep. Dina had offered. Eleanor had almost said no out of pride, out of that particular stubbornness that had been both her greatest strength and her most persistent problem. But her daughter moved inside her at exactly the wrong moment. A sharp elbow pressed against her ribs like a small, insistent reminder, and Eleanor said yes. The apartment above Perch was small and smelled like coffee and old wood and something faintly floral she couldn't identify. One bedroom, a window that looked out onto the fire escape, a bed with a quilt that Dina had clearly put on specifically for her because it was the nice one, the cream and blue one that Eleanor had admired once, 2 winters ago, when Dina had shown it to her after buying it at a craft fair in Brooklyn. Dina remembered. Of course she did. Eleanor sat on the edge of that bed that first night and didn't sleep for a long time. She didn't cry either. She just sat with her hand on her stomach and thought about her grandmother and about 60 years of quiet power, and about the particular look on Grant's face when he'd handed her that trash bag, so certain, so completely without doubt that he had all the leverage in the world. She thought about that look for a long time. Then she opened her laptop, which she'd had in her purse. She always had her laptop a habit from years of managing Grant's household correspondence and event scheduling, and the dozen other invisible labors that no one names and everyone depends on, and she started reading. She read every document Vivian had sent her before leaving the coffee shop. She read the trust deed. She read the property schedule. She read the lease agreements, all of them, every clause, every addendum, starting with the one for the residential tower on West 68th Street, whose penthouse apartment her husband currently occupied. The lease was a 30-year commercial agreement established in 1998, renewed twice, managed through a holding company called Greystone Property Partners, LLC, which was itself managed by a firm called Hartwell Management Services, she was beginning to understand how her grandmother thought entirely contained within the Hartwell Urban Trust. Grant had been paying rent every month to her grandmother's trust for 4 years. Before that, the previous tenant had paid it for 26 years. Nobody in Grant's organization had ever looked closely enough to trace who they were actually paying. Or perhaps they had looked and hadn't looked hard enough. Either way, the building was hers, and the eviction notice he'd served her this morning was, she read the lease clause 3 times to be sure not only invalid, but potentially actionable. Because the trust as property owner had governance rights over residential agreements in that building, and those rights had never been waived, and no subtenant had standing to evict anyone without the trust's approval. He had tried to evict her from her own building, using a mechanism that required her own permission. She almost laughed. She didn't, but she almost did. She typed an email to Vivian at 11:47 at night and said, "I finished reading. I have questions. Can we speak at 8 tomorrow morning?" Vivian replied at 11:51. "I'll call you at 8. Get some rest, Miss Hayes. You're going to need it." Eleanor closed the laptop, put her hand on her stomach. Her daughter was quiet, now finally settled deep and still. "We're going to be okay," Eleanor told her, not performing it, not hoping it, stating it the way you state a fact you've just confirmed with primary sources. She lay down. She pulled the cream and blue quilt up to her shoulder. She slept. 6 hours later, she woke up, made tea on Dina's small kettle, and sat at the window watching the street come alive below. A bakery truck. A woman walking 2 identical dogs. A teenager in a school uniform who was very clearly running late and not particularly concerned about it. At exactly 8 o'clock, her phone rang. "Good morning," Vivian said. "How are you feeling?" "Clear," Eleanor said. "I read everything." "I assumed you would." "The eviction notice is void." A pause that contained Eleanor thought the precise texture of professional satisfaction. "It is, on 3 separate grounds. Your husband's legal team either didn't know who they were actually dealing with, or they were sloppy, possibly both. I want to challenge it formally. We can do that. It will be quiet. No press. A letter from our firm to his firm citing the relevant provisions. His lawyers will understand immediately what it means. How quickly? The letter goes out today. His team receives it tomorrow. I would expect them to need 48 hours to fully understand what they're looking at. After that, another precise pause. I would expect panic. Eleanor thought about Grant's face. That controlled corporate expression, the slightly bored tone. Good, she said. There are other matters we should discuss, Vivian said. Have you retained a divorce attorney? Not yet. I have a recommendation. Her name is Sandra Osei. She is, I will say this plainly, the most effective family law attorney in the city for cases involving substantial assets and a pregnant spouse. She is also deeply discreet. I've already taken the liberty of sending her the relevant trust documentation so that she understands the full picture before you speak. You sent her my documents without asking me. I sent her a summary, nothing specific. I wanted her to have context. Vivian's tone was calm, but not defensive. It was the tone of someone who has been doing this for 40 years and understands the difference between overstepping and being prepared. If you prefer someone else, that is entirely your choice, but I wanted you to have the option. Eleanor considered this. A woman who moved ahead, anticipated, prepared. Her grandmother had trusted this woman completely. Set the meeting, Eleanor said. She can see you Thursday at 2. Thursday at 2, Eleanor confirmed. One more thing, Vivian said, and something in her tone shifted, not softer exactly, but more deliberate, like someone choosing words the way you choose steps on uncertain ground. I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with, Ms. Hayes, because it's important that you make decisions with complete information. Tell me, your husband's company, Mercer Capital, has been operating under the assumption that its primary asset holdings, the properties it owns, controls, or leverages, represent a stable foundation. Several of those properties are directly adjacent to or dependent on trust properties for access utilities and certain licensing agreements. Those relationships have been informal historically, undocumented. Eleanor went very still. What does that mean? It means, Vivian said carefully, that when we formalize the trust's ownership and begin requiring proper documentation and renegotiation of those informal arrangements, there will be certain complications for Mercer Capital's portfolio. How significant? That depends on choices you make. You could maintain the status quo. You could renegotiate on standard commercial terms, which would significantly increase Grant's operating costs. Or you could, within the bounds of what the trust's charter permits, decline to renew certain informal arrangements when they lapse. The silence stretched between them across the phone. When do they lapse? Eleanor asked. Several of them, Vivian said, lapse at the end of this quarter. The end of this quarter was 11 weeks away. 11 weeks. She thought about the trash bag. About not suitable, about upgrade, about scrambled eggs made at 8:45 while a legal notice was being filed. I understand, Eleanor said. Let me think about what I want to do. Of course, there's no urgency. You hold all the cards, Ms. Hayes. That's not a figure of speech. You hold all of them. A pause. I'll send Sandra's contact information within the hour. The call ended. Eleanor set her phone on the table. Dina appeared from the kitchen with a plate of toast and the expression of a woman who was pretending she hadn't been standing near the door. How much did you hear? Eleanor asked. None of it, Dina said, setting the toast down. Almost all of it. I couldn't help it, the walls are thin. She sat down across from her. What does it mean, what she was saying? It means, Eleanor said slowly, picking up a piece of toast, that my husband spent 6 years telling everyone he built an empire, and it turns out he built it on land that belonged to my grandmother. Dina stared at her. And now it belongs to me, Eleanor said. The toast was very good. Dina made excellent toast. Eleanor ate the whole piece before either of them said another word. Then Dina said very quietly, Ellie, what are you going to do? Eleanor looked at her, and for the first time since the morning before, since the trash bag, since the lobby, since all of it, something in her face opened up. Not softened exactly, something more like resolved, like a decision that had been forming underground for a long time had finally broken the surface. I'm going to be very, very quiet, Eleanor said, and I'm going to let the paperwork do the talking. That afternoon, she called her mother. This was not a call she'd been looking forward to. Her mother, Patricia Hayes, was 71 years old, lived in Westchester, had strong opinions about most things, and had never fully approved of Grant Mercer, a fact she had communicated primarily through a series of precise, well-timed silences over 6 years of dinners and holidays. The phone rang twice, then, "Eleanor, I was wondering when you'd call." "Hi, Mom. Are you safe?" "I'm safe. I'm at Dina's." "Good. Dina is sensible." A pause. "Your sister called me this morning. She saw something on Instagram." Eleanor closed her eyes. "What did she see?" "A woman, young, in your apartment, apparently posting photographs of the view." Another pause with the specific quality of a silence that contains a very large number of things being deliberately not said. "She tagged your husband. So Tessa was already posting, already performing the upgrade publicly." Eleanor thought about that for a moment, about the particular recklessness of a woman who doesn't know that the apartment she's posing in doesn't belong to the man who invited her there. Creating evidence, Vivian would later say, unknowingly. "Mom," Eleanor said, "I need to tell you some things about Grandma Maggie's estate." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This one was alert. "Go on," Patricia said. Eleanor told her, not everything, not the strategy, not Vivian's advice, not the specific properties or the specific numbers, but the shape of it, the trust, the inheritance, what it meant. When she finished, her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She told me you know, not everything, but she told me there was something set aside for you. She said—" Her mother's voice shifted, took on the particular timbre of someone quoting someone they loved. She said, "Ellie is going to need a foundation patty, not money, a foundation. There's a difference." And I asked her what she meant, and she said I'd understand when the time came. Eleanor felt something move through her chest. Not grief exactly, more like recognition. "I understand now," Eleanor said quietly. "So do I," her mother said. And then unexpectedly, fiercely, "Don't let him take anything else from you. You hear me? Not one more thing." "I hear you, Mom." "And eat something. You're pregnant. Your grandmother would be furious if you weren't eating." "I'm eating. Dina made toast." "Dina always makes excellent toast." They hung up. By Wednesday, 3 things had happened. The first, Vivian's firm sent the letter to Grant's legal team. 11 pages. Formal, dense, completely unambiguous in its identification of the trust's ownership of the residential tower and the legal nullity of the eviction notice. Eleanor hadn't seen the letter, but Vivian had read her the key paragraph over the phone, and even in legal language, it had the quality of a door being calmly, firmly shut in someone's face. The second, Eleanor met with Sandra Osei, who turned out to be 44, precise with natural hair and an office full of plants and the habit of looking at you like she was reading the complete text of you rather than just the surface. She listened to Eleanor for 40 minutes without writing anything down. Then she picked up her pen and said, "Okay, let's talk about what you want." "Protection for my daughter," Eleanor said immediately. "Custody structure that prioritizes her stability, and a divorce that documents what this marriage actually was." "Can you be more specific about that last part?" "I left a graduate program at Columbia. I managed his household, his correspondence, his social calendar, his professional relationships. I was invisible infrastructure for 6 years while he built something he's calling his own." Eleanor paused. "I want the record to reflect that." Sandra nodded slowly. She was writing now. "And the trust Vivian briefed me on the basic structure. Are you planning to use it actively in the divorce proceedings?" "I'm planning," Eleanor said carefully, "to make sure that when the full picture of this marriage is visible, my contributions are part of that picture. What the trust enables or doesn't enable in terms of legal strategy, that's your area, not mine." Sandra looked at her over her notepad for a moment. "You know," she said, "most people come in here angry, which is understandable. You're something different." "What am I?" "Organized," Sandra said, and there was something in her voice that Eleanor recognized as respect. "Let's get to work." The third thing that happened by Wednesday, Grant called. She almost didn't answer, but she thought about what Vivian had said. Complete information make decisions with complete information, and she picked up. "Eleanor." His voice was different. The board meeting tone was still there, but underneath it, something else, something tighter. "My lawyers received a letter." "I imagine they did," she said. A pause. "Who is Vivian Cross?" "She's my attorney." "Since when do you have an attorney?" "Since Tuesday," Eleanor said pleasantly. Another pause. Longer. She could hear him processing, could almost hear the specific sound of a very controlled man encountering something he hadn't anticipated and deciding how to frame his response. "The letter makes certain claims about property ownership that are, we need to discuss this, Eleanor. There are things you clearly don't understand about how these lease structures work, and I don't want you to—" "Grant," she said. He stopped. "I understand exactly how the lease structures work," she said. "I read the documents, all of them. I had 3 hours with Vivian on Monday and another 2 on Tuesday. I understand what the trust owns, what that means for your building, what that means for your company, and what that means for the eviction notice. You served me the same morning you asked me to make you eggs." She paused. "I don't think I'm the one who doesn't understand something here." The silence was very long. When he spoke again, the board meeting tone was entirely gone. What replaced it was something rawer, something that might, in a different man, have been fear. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" "Nothing," she said. "I'm not doing anything, Grant. I'm just existing in the life my grandmother built for me." She kept her voice level, warm almost. "You should talk to your lawyers. They'll explain what the letter means." She hung up. Her hands were not shaking. She looked at them to confirm, completely steady. She pressed one flat against her stomach, felt her daughter move a slow, rolling shift, like a small planet adjusting its orbit, and she breathed. Thursday morning, something appeared on Tessa Vale's Instagram. A photograph taken through a floor-to-ceiling window. The city spread below. The caption read, "Waking up at the top feels different when you've earned it." 47,000 likes within 6 hours. Eleanor saw it because her sister texted her the screenshot with 3 question marks and nothing else. She forwarded it to Vivian with a single line. "Is this what you meant by creating evidence?" Vivian replied within 4 minutes. "Yes. Please don't engage. Let her continue." Eleanor put her phone down and went back to the notes she was making. She had started keeping a detailed record dates, conversations, decisions, every interaction since Monday morning. Not for any single purpose. Just because she was someone who believed in documentation. In the record. In the irreversible factuality of things written down at the time they happened. She wrote down the time of Grant's call, the substance of it, his exact words when the board meeting tone had slipped. "What are you doing?" She wrote down her own answer. Nothing. It wasn't nothing. But nothing was the right answer, because what she was doing required exactly that stillness on the surface, everything moving underneath the way a river looks calm from a bridge and is completely different from inside it. By Friday, she'd heard from Vivian that Grant's legal team had requested an urgent meeting to discuss the letter. Vivian had responded that she was available the following Tuesday and not before. By Saturday, she'd heard from Sandra that Grant's divorce attorneys, he'd already engaged divorce attorneys, which she'd expected had made a preliminary outreach suggesting a quiet settlement. Sandra had responded with a document outlining Eleanor's initial position on asset division, spousal support, and custody that was, as Sandra described it to Eleanor over the phone, comprehensive. "How did they respond?" Eleanor asked. "They asked for 2 weeks to review." "That's fine." "Eleanor?" Sandra's voice took on that particular quality again, precise, direct, but with something underneath it that was almost gentle. "They're going to push back hard. When they understand the full picture of the trust, they're going to argue that it's separate property, that it predates the marriage, that you had no active role in managing it during the marriage. They're going to try to minimize it." "Let them try," Eleanor said. "You need to be prepared for this to get difficult." "Sandra." Eleanor paused. She was sitting at the window again, the street below, the ordinary movement of a city going about its Saturday business. "I was handed a trash bag. I was served an eviction notice while my husband was eating eggs I made him. I was told I was no longer suitable, and that a 26-year-old was an upgrade." She paused again. "I have been preparing for difficult my entire life. I just didn't know it." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Then we're ready." What Eleanor didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, sitting at that window on that Saturday morning, 7 months pregnant, surrounded by the quiet architecture of a plan still assembling itself. was that across the city, in an office tower that sat on land belonging to her grandmother's trust, Grant Mercer was having a very different kind of Saturday. He was on his third call of the morning with his legal team. He had been according to information that would reach Eleanor weeks later through a chain of professional discretion she'd later find almost comical, alternating between controlled fury and something his lead attorney had privately described to a colleague as visible unraveling, because the letter had been 11 pages, and his lawyers had read it, and then they'd read it again, and then they'd done what lawyers do. They'd pulled the relevant property records, the lease structures, the ownership registrations, and what they'd found had required a fourth reading, and then a call to a real estate specialist, and then a very quiet, very serious meeting behind closed doors. What they'd found was simple, irrefutable, documented across 60 years of meticulous trust management. The building Grant called his headquarters sat on Hartwell land. The residential tower he called home sat on Hartwell land. 3 of his 5 major investment properties had Hartwell Trust easements running through their titles that nobody had ever bothered to read carefully because they'd been there so long they'd become invisible, like load-bearing walls, that everyone assumes are decorative until someone starts renovation. His entire financial architecture had a foundation he'd never examined, and the woman who owned that foundation had just very quietly, without raising her voice, without a single public statement, begun to make that known. Grant had built his empire on land he'd never owned, and the woman he'd handed a trash bag to on Monday morning was the woman who owned it. His lawyer had said it to him directly on that third call on that Saturday morning, with the careful precision of someone delivering a diagnosis. "Mr. Mercer, we need to talk about your exposure here, because it is significant." And Grant Mercer, who had spent 15 years being the most untouchable man in every room he entered, had said nothing for a very long time. Eleanor didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting at a window in a small apartment above a coffee shop drinking tea, hand on her stomach, watching a city she was only beginning to understand she'd always owned. Her daughter moved, that slow, certain shift. "I know," Eleanor said. "I know." She picked up her pen. She went back to her notes. She kept writing. The Tuesday meeting between Vivian's firm and Grant's legal team lasted 2 hours and 19 minutes. Eleanor knew this because Vivian called her at 4:17 that afternoon, and the first thing she said was, 2 hours and 19 minutes. That's how long it took them to fully understand what they were looking at. "And," Eleanor said, "and they are," a precise pause concerned. Eleanor was sitting at the small desk in Dina's upstairs apartment, her notes spread in front of her, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray and close, the kind of October sky that couldn't decide whether to rain. "Tell me what happened," she said. Their lead attorney, a man named Callahan, very senior, very expensive, opened by suggesting that the trust's ownership claims were overstated and that the lease structures would not survive scrutiny. He was confident, almost dismissive. Vivian's tone was perfectly even. I let him finish. Then I gave him the 1962 trust deed, the 1987 renewal documentation, the 2003 property schedule update, and the 17 cross-references in the city's public property records that confirm every single ownership claim in our letter. A beat. He stopped being dismissive approximately 4 minutes into reading the 1987 renewal. What did he say? He asked for a recess. 20 minutes. When he came back, the tone of the meeting had changed entirely. Another pause. He asked whether the trust would be open to a negotiated resolution. Eleanor's hand tightened slightly around the phone. What kind of resolution? That's what's interesting. He didn't specify. He was fishing, I think, trying to understand the shape of what you want without revealing how much they've realized they've lost. Vivian's voice was steady, but Eleanor had been listening to it carefully enough now to hear the current running underneath it. Something that was satisfaction-controlled and professional but unmistakably real. I told him that the trust's position was that all ownership claims would be formally documented and all informal arrangements would require renegotiation on standard commercial terms. Nothing more, nothing less. How did he react? He said he would need to consult with his client. Of course he did. Eleanor. Vivian's voice shifted that deliberate choosing steps quality again. I want to prepare you for something. When Grant fully understands the scope of this, and I believe he is beginning to, his response is unlikely to be graceful. Men who have built their identity around a particular narrative of their own success do not respond gracefully when that narrative is threatened. "I know who he is," Eleanor said quietly. "I know you do. I'm saying be careful. Not of him legally. We are very solid legally. But personally, he may try to reach you in ways that feel different from the formal channels. He may try to make this about your relationship rather than about property law. It is a tactic." Eleanor thought about the phone call, the way his voice had changed when the board meeting tone had slipped. "What are you doing?" The rawness of it. The unfamiliarity of a man confronting something he couldn't control with the tools he'd always used. "I understand," she said. "Good. One more thing. The informal utility and access arrangements. I mentioned the ones that lapse at the end of the quarter. I've been reviewing the documentation more carefully. There are two specifically that are critical to Mercer Capital's current operations. Without formal renegotiation, those lapses would create functional complications." "How functional?" "One affects the fiber infrastructure routing that serves his Park Avenue headquarters. The other affects a shared loading and service access point that 3 of his major residential properties depend on for their operating licenses." She paused. "Neither of these were ever documented in the original lease agreements. They've been informal courtesies extended by your grandmother's management company for over 20 years. Courtesies she was under no obligation to extend, none whatsoever. And I'm under no obligation to continue." "None whatsoever," Vivian said again. Eleanor picked up her pen. She turned it between her fingers once, set it down. "Leave them," she said. "Let them lapse. Don't send any notice. Just let the quarter end." A brief silence. "You're certain?" "He served me an eviction notice while I was making him breakfast," Eleanor said. "Yes, I'm certain." "Then we'll let the quarter end." That night, Eleanor ate dinner with Dina Pasta Simple, the kind Dina made when she wanted to feed someone without making it an event, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with Grant Mercer. They talked about Dina's niece who was applying to culinary school. They talked about a book they'd both read 3 years ago and never finished discussing. They talked about the best meal Eleanor could remember eating, which turned out to be a bowl of seafood soup at a small restaurant in Lisbon on a solo trip she'd taken the year before she met Grant when she was 28, and finishing her master's research and so certain of the shape her life was going to take. "Do you miss it?" Dina asked. "That version of yourself?" Eleanor thought about it seriously the way Dina's questions always deserved. "I don't think I lost her," Eleanor said finally. "I think she just went very quiet for a while, the way you turn down the volume on something when there's too much noise in the room." Dina looked at her for a long moment. "She's not quiet anymore." "No," Eleanor said. "She's not." The following morning, 3 weeks after the trash bag, Eleanor's phone rang at 7:42. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something instinct or the particular way the morning felt alert and charged made her pick up. "Is this Eleanor Hayes?" A woman's voice. Young, slightly uncertain. Not a professional call. Personal. "It is," Eleanor said carefully. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "My name is Claire Sutton. I worked at Mercer Capital for 2 years. I left in March." Another pause. "I'm sorry to call like this. I got your number from, it doesn't matter how I got it. I need to tell you something. About your husband. About the company." Eleanor sat down. "I'm listening." What Claire Sutton told her in a voice that started uncertain and steadied as it went took 22 minutes. Eleanor did not interrupt. She let the woman talk. She listened the way Vivian had listened to her completely without signaling reaction, taking everything in. Claire had been a financial analyst at Mercer Capital. She had, in the course of her work, become aware of certain transactions, movements of funds between corporate accounts and personal accounts, valuations, on properties that didn't match the independent assessments she'd been asked to cross-reference a pattern of representations to investors that she had come to believe did not accurately reflect the underlying asset picture. She had raised it internally. She had been told it was above her level. She had raised it again. She had been moved to a different department. 3 weeks later, she had been let go for reasons her termination letter described as restructuring. She had consulted an employment attorney. She had been sitting on this information for 7 months, uncertain what to do with it, worried about retaliation, watching from the outside as Grant Mercer continued to be celebrated as a visionary in exactly the rooms where she believed he was misleading people. "Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor asked when Claire finished. "Because I saw what he did to you," Claire said. "I know what that building is. I know what the trust owns, and I know," her voice steadied further, "that you're the only person who has both the standing and the resources to do something about it." "What you're describing," Eleanor said carefully, "is potentially more than a civil matter." "I know. Have you spoken to anyone else about this, anyone official?" "No, not yet." "I want to give you a name," Eleanor said. She thought for a moment. "Vivian Cross. She is my attorney. She is absolutely trustworthy. I want you to call her today and tell her exactly what you told me. Will you do that?" A long pause. Then, "Yes." "Claire," Eleanor paused. "You did the right thing raising it internally, and you're doing the right thing now. What he does in his company is his responsibility. What you do with what you know is yours." When she hung up, she sat very still for a moment. Then she called Vivian. "I just spoke with a former employee of Mercer Capital," she said the moment Vivian picked up. "Her name is Claire Sutton. She's going to call you. I need you to hear what she has to say." "What kind of information?" "The kind," Eleanor said, "that goes beyond property law." Vivian was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I see. I'll clear my afternoon." 3 days later, 2 things happened simultaneously on the same Thursday morning that Eleanor would later think of as the moment the architecture of Grant's world began to visibly shift. The first, Vivian's firm sent formal notification to 3 of Mercer Capital's major institutional investors' pension fund managers who had been partners in 2 of Grant's flagship property developments, informing them that certain properties included in the investment prospectuses were subject to Hartwell Urban Trust ownership, claims that had not been disclosed in the offering documents. The letter did not accuse anyone of fraud. It simply provided information. Accurate, documented, sourced information, and it invited the investors to review their agreements in light of this information. It was as Vivian described it to Eleanor afterward, a very polite letter that will cause a very significant amount of panic. The second thing that happened that Thursday morning, Tessa Vale posted again. This time it was a short video. She was standing at the window. Eleanor recognized the 40-floor view, the one she'd looked out every morning for 4 years, holding a coffee mug and a silk robe that Eleanor also recognized because she'd bought it herself in Florence. She was speaking directly to the camera in the easy, practiced way of someone who had built an audience by performing her life in real time. "Good morning from the top," she said, smiling. "When your person believes in your vision, every morning feels like this." 214,000 views by noon. Eleanor watched it once. Then she forwarded it to Vivian with a 2-word message, "Still posting." Vivian's response came back in under 3 minutes. "Perfect. Every post is a timestamp. Every tagged location is a documented residency. She is building our case for us." Eleanor set her phone face down on the desk. She picked up her pen. She went back to her notes. That same afternoon, Sandra called with an update on the divorce proceedings. Grant's attorneys had responded to Eleanor's initial position document. Their counter was as Sandra described it, with the precise language of someone who had read too many of these to be surprised, but could still recognize a particularly aggressive one, ambitious. "They're arguing the trust is irrelevant to the marital estate," Sandra said. "They're characterizing your 6 years as a homemaker as a personal choice that doesn't create financial obligation. They're suggesting that any support arrangement should be minimal." "Minimal," Eleanor repeated. Their word. "And the pregnancy, the custody framework. They've proposed a joint arrangement that is structured in a way that would require you to remain within a specific geographic radius of Grant's primary residence." Sandra's voice was carefully neutral, "which is, of course, the building owned by your grandmother's trust." "He wants to use custody as a geographic anchor," Eleanor said flatly. "That's a reasonable reading of the proposal." "Sandra, is that legal?" Geographic restrictions in custody agreements are not uncommon. Whether this particular framing would survive judicial review is a different question. A pause. "My recommendation is that we reject the counter entirely and request a formal hearing. I want this in front of a judge not negotiated privately between attorneys. A judge who sees the full picture, a 7 months pregnant woman served with an eviction notice by her husband on the same morning she made his breakfast. A woman who gave up her graduate education. A trust of this scale will not look favorably on minimal." "Then let's get in front of a judge," Eleanor said. "I'll file the request this week." When she hung up, she sat with her hand on her stomach for a moment. Her daughter was active today, restless turning, pushing back against the inside of her ribs with a determination that Eleanor was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "He's not going to get to do that," she told her. "I promise." It was the first promise she'd made out loud. She meant it in every single atom of herself. The following week brought the quarter's end closer, and with it, the lapse of the two informal arrangements Vivian had identified. Eleanor had thought briefly about whether to send advance notice, a professional courtesy documentation of the lapse, a chance for Grant's team to scramble for alternatives. She had thought about it for approximately 40 seconds and decided against it. He had not given her advance notice. He had filed the eviction notice at 9:14 in the morning and then sat down to eat the eggs she'd made him without saying a word. No notice. Let the quarter end. On a Monday morning, 11 days before the quarter's close, Vivian called at 8 sharp. "Something has happened," she said, and her voice had a quality Eleanor hadn't heard in it before, not alarm exactly, but heightened. Alert. "Tell me." Mercer Capital had a board meeting last week. "I've received information through legitimate channels. I want to be clear that the board has begun an internal review of certain financial representations in the investor prospectuses for the two flagship developments. The review was apparently prompted by," Vivian paused, "inquiries from one of the institutional investors who received our letter." Eleanor closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "It's moving faster than I expected," she said. "Yes." A pause. "I want to be transparent with you about something, Eleanor. When this began, I anticipated a contained civil matter. Property law, divorce proceedings, and negotiated resolution. What Claire Sutton brought to me changes the texture of this significantly. I have been in contact with an attorney who specializes in securities regulation. Not to act, not yet, but to understand the full picture. Do you think what Claire described is actionable? I think," Vivian said carefully, "that what Claire described is consistent with patterns that have attracted regulatory attention in other cases. I am not in a position to make specific predictions. But I want you to understand that the situation may develop in directions that go beyond what either of us initially anticipated." Eleanor thought about this, about the shape of something that had started as a trash bag on a Monday morning and had grown in 3 weeks into something with dimensions she was still mapping. "Is this going to become public?" she asked. "I don't know. That depends on what the board review finds and whether anyone with standing to report to regulators chooses to do so." A pause. "Claire Sutton has that standing if she chooses to use it." "That's her choice," Eleanor said, "not mine." "Agreed. I just want you to be prepared." She was prepared. She had come to understand, always more prepared than anyone expected. That was the invisible labor of 6 years, being the infrastructure, being the organized one, being the person who knew where everything was and what everything meant and how everything connected, while the man who depended on all of that infrastructure took credit for the architecture it held up. That evening, Dina knocked on the apartment door and said there was someone downstairs. Eleanor came down to find her sister Rachel sitting at the corner table with a bottle of wine she clearly hadn't ordered from Dina's menu because Perch didn't serve wine, and Dina was pretending not to see it. Rachel was 3 years younger than Eleanor, lived in Brooklyn, worked in documentary film, and had the quality of someone who processed the world through her eyes first and her words second. She stood up when Eleanor came in and grabbed her in a hug that lasted longer than most of Rachel's hugs, which were not short. "I've been waiting for you to call me," Rachel said into Eleanor's shoulder. "And then I realized you weren't going to call me because you were being strong and organized and handling it, so I came." "I was going to call you," Eleanor said. "When... this week." Rachel pulled back and looked at her. "You look..." She stopped. "You look different. Not bad different. Just different." "Different how?" Rachel thought about it. "Like something cleared," she said finally. "Like the weather changed." She looked down at Eleanor's stomach. "Hi, baby," she said softer. They sat down. Dina brought them both chamomile tea and pointedly removed the wine bottle, though Eleanor caught her setting it behind the counter rather than throwing it away, which was very Dina. Eleanor told Rachel most of it, the parts that mattered, the trust, the properties, what it meant, not the strategy, not the specific moves, not the quarter-end laps, not Claire Sutton, because those weren't hers to share, but the shape of what was happening. Rachel listened, the way she listened to documentary subjects, completely. Without construction, without building her response while Eleanor was still talking, just receiving it. When Eleanor finished, Rachel said, "Grandma Maggie knew, didn't she? She knew about him." "I think she suspected. Vivian won't say it directly, but yes, I think she knew. She was protecting you." "She was building me a door," Eleanor said. "She said so in the letter, a door she kept open." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "And now you're walking through it." "I'm walking through it." Rachel reached across the table and put her hand over Eleanor's, just held it there, the kind of gesture that doesn't need words because the words would only make it smaller. Outside, the city continued. A taxi. Someone's music too loud, briefly closed, then gone. The ordinary pulse of a place too large to stop for anyone's story. But Eleanor's story was not stopping. 6 days before the quarters close, Grant called again. She was in Sandra's office for a scheduled check-in when the call came through, and she looked at Sandra, who gave a single nod, and she answered on speaker. "Eleanor." His voice was tighter now than it had been in the Saturday call. Something was fraying in it, the edges of his composure showing wear. "We need to meet, in person. No attorneys." "That's not something I'm going to do," she said. "Eleanor, this has gone far enough. You don't understand what the board is asking questions that—" He stopped. Reset. She could almost see him gripping the bridge of his nose the way he did when he was trying to compose himself in difficult meetings. "There are things happening right now that you're not seeing the full picture of. If you'd just let me explain." "Grant." Her voice was steady, completely steady. Sandra was watching her with the expression of someone watching a very precise surgical procedure. "Your attorneys and my attorneys are in communication. That is the appropriate channel. I'm not asking to talk about attorneys. I'm asking to talk to you, as someone who knows you." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Eleanor, we were together for 6 years. You can give me 20 minutes. The morning you had me served with an eviction notice," she said quietly, "I had made you breakfast 45 minutes earlier. Scrambled eggs with chives, because that's what you asked for. You sat down and ate them and said thank you and didn't say a single word about the legal filing that was happening at that exact moment." She paused. "You had 20 minutes that morning. You chose not to use them." The silence that followed was very long. When he spoke again, the fraying was complete. The board meeting voice was gone. What was underneath it was something she didn't have a precise name for, not remorse exactly, because she didn't think Grant was capable of full remorse, not in this moment. More like the sound of a man standing at the edge of something, and only now understanding how high up he is. "What do you want?" he said, raw, direct, stripped of strategy. "I want my daughter to have a stable life," she said. "I want what I'm owed for 6 years. I want the record to reflect accurately what this marriage was." She paused. "And I want you to go talk to your attorneys, Grant, because they're the ones who can actually help you right now." She ended the call. Sandra looked at her across the desk. "That," Sandra said, "is going in my notes as the most controlled conversation I have witnessed in 20 years of family law." "Is it enough?" Eleanor asked. "For the record, the call was recorded with his knowledge as required by law since you told him at the start." "Yes, it's enough." Sandra clicked her pen. "Eleanor, I want to ask you something directly. Are you doing okay? Not legally. Personally." Eleanor thought about it. Genuinely thought about it the way the question deserved. "I'm more okay than I've been in 6 years," she said, "and I'm more tired than I've ever been in my life. Both things are true at the same time." Sandra nodded. "That's the most honest answer I've heard in this office in a long time." Eleanor picked up her coat. She walked out of Sandra's building into the November air, which had turned sharp and clean, the kind of cold that clarifies everything. She stood on the pavement for a moment. Her phone buzzed. A text from Vivian. "Quarter ends Friday. Are we still letting it lapse?" Eleanor typed back immediately. "Yes." She put her phone in her pocket, put her hand on her stomach. Her daughter pressed back that reliable, steady presence. Friday was 4 days away. She walked toward the subway. Around her, the city moved in its ordinary and different way, people going places, carrying things, living the 1,000 small, ordinary lives that make up the texture of a city at noon on a Tuesday in November. Somewhere in that city, in an office tower that sat on her grandmother's land, Grant Mercer was having a very bad week that was about to get significantly worse. Somewhere in that city, Tessa Vale was posting photographs from a window that belonged technically legally entirely to Eleanor Hayes. And Eleanor Hayes was walking to the subway, hand on her stomach, completely steady, moving through a city she was only beginning to understand she had always owned. Friday was 4 days away. The doors were about to start closing. Friday came the way significant days always do, quietly, without announcement, indistinguishable from any other morning, until it wasn't. Eleanor woke at 6:14. Her daughter was already awake, active and insistent against her ribs, as if she understood that something was happening today, as if she had inherited her great-grandmother's particular sensitivity to the weight of moments. Eleanor made tea, sat at the window, watched the street. At 7:53, her phone buzzed. Vivian. A single line. The quarter closed at midnight. The arrangements have lapsed. It begins now. Eleanor read it twice, set her phone face down on the table, put both hands around her mug. The tea was still hot. She had thought she would feel something large when this moment came. Relief or satisfaction, or the particular release of a held breath. Instead, what she felt was simpler than that. Quieter. The feeling of a door swinging open on well-oiled hinges, exactly as designed, exactly as her grandmother had always intended. She picked up her phone. Typed back to Vivian, understood. Let me know when they realize. Vivian's response came in 4 minutes. They'll know by 9. These things always surface at 9. She was right. At 9:07, Vivian called. Mercer Capital's Park Avenue headquarters lost fiber connectivity at 8:42 this morning, Vivian said without preamble. Their IT team has been working the problem for 25 minutes. They will shortly discover that the infrastructure routing runs through a Hartwell property and that the informal access arrangement that permitted it expired at midnight. Eleanor said nothing. She waited. Additionally, Vivian continued, the service access point for his 3 residential properties on the east side has been flagged by the building management companies as unavailable. Their operating licenses require documentation of service access. Without the informal arrangement, they don't have it. A pause. 2 of those properties have tenants. The management companies are already fielding calls. Is anyone going to be actually harmed by this? Eleanor asked. The tenants, real people. No. The service access issue affects common area maintenance scheduling, not emergency access or utilities. It's an inconvenience for the management companies. For the tenants themselves, nothing changes today. Vivian's voice was precise about this, and Eleanor appreciated the precision because it was the question that mattered most. The impact is entirely on the operating and financial side of Grant's portfolio. His companies, his agreements, his numbers. Okay, Eleanor said. His legal team will be calling us within the hour to request emergency renegotiation. What will you tell them? That we are available to discuss formal commercial arrangements at our earliest convenient opening, which is, another pause, 3 weeks from today. Eleanor almost smiled. 3 weeks. We are a very busy firm, Vivian said, and her voice was exactly as composed as it always was, but something underneath it had the quality of someone who has spent 40 years waiting for exactly this kind of morning. I'll keep you informed. She hung up. Eleanor sat with her tea. Outside, the November street was ordinary and alive. She thought about the moment she'd stood in the lobby of that building with the eviction notice in her hands, and Dennis not at the desk, and the suited men who had performed their professional task without meeting her eyes. She thought about how small and certain Grant's world had felt, then how total his control had seemed. She thought about how much had been true that neither of them knew yet. Then she got dressed because she had a meeting with Sandra at 10:30, and she had never once in her adult life been late to a meeting that mattered. Sandra's office that morning had a different energy than the previous visits. Sandra herself was moving with the particular focus of someone who has received significant new information and is organizing it in real time. She greeted Eleanor at the door, rather than waiting at her desk, which was unusual enough to be notable. Sit down, Sandra said. I have things to tell you, and I want to tell them in order. Eleanor sat. Tell me. The request for a formal hearing has been granted. We're on the calendar for January 8th. Sandra sat across from her. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Grant's attorneys called me at 8:15 this morning, before I suspect they were dealing with whatever is happening on the property side. They want to revisit the settlement terms. They want to negotiate again. They want to negotiate significantly differently than they were negotiating 2 weeks ago. The counter they sent, the one with the geographic restriction, the minimal support, they've withdrawn it. Formally withdrawn it, which requires paperwork, which means they didn't just change their minds. They want the original counter off the record. Eleanor looked at her steadily. Why would they want it off the record? Because, Sandra said carefully, if this goes in front of a judge in January, and the judge sees that they proposed a minimal support arrangement for a woman who is 8 months pregnant and happens to be the controlling trustee of one of the city's largest private property trusts, it looks bad. It looks very bad. They want to pretend they never sent it. Can they do that? They can withdraw it. I cannot be compelled to forget I received it. Sandra's expression was precisely professional, but Eleanor caught the edge of something sharper underneath. I have very good notes. What are they proposing now? They haven't proposed anything specific yet. They asked for a meeting. I told them I'd consult with my client and get back to them. She paused. Here is my read, Eleanor. They are scared, not of the divorce proceedings specifically, though they should be, but of the larger picture. The institutional investor letters, the board review, whatever is happening with the property arrangements this morning. They are watching multiple fronts open simultaneously, and they are realizing that the position they thought they were negotiating from does not exist. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Sandra, she said, if we went to the January hearing, if we put this fully in front of a judge, what's the realistic outcome? Sandra looked at her directly. With the trust documentation, the record of what you contributed to this marriage, the withdrawn counter, his conduct, I think the outcome is very good. I think a judge who sees the complete picture of this marriage will be generous to you. She paused. But I want to be honest with you about something. Litigation is exposure, for both sides. It is slower, more exhausting, and more unpredictable than a negotiated resolution, and you are 8 months pregnant. I'm aware. I'm not telling you to settle. I'm telling you to make the decision with full information. Sandra leaned forward slightly. What do you want most, not legally? As a woman, what matters most to you out of all of this? Eleanor didn't hesitate. She had thought about this question in different forms for weeks, lying awake at night in Dina's apartment, with her hand on her stomach and her grandmother's letter memorized. I want my daughter protected, she said. I want the custody arrangement to be real, not geographic manipulation, not a tool for him to maintain control over where I live. I want support that reflects what this marriage actually cost me, not a settlement designed to make me go away quietly. She paused. And I want the divorce on record as what it was, not a mutual decision, not irreconcilable differences because we grew apart. I want the record to say what he did. Sandra was writing. She wrote for a moment after Eleanor stopped talking, making sure she had it all. Okay, she said. Then here's what I recommend. We meet with his attorneys. We listen to their new proposal. We do not accept anything that doesn't address all 3 of those things completely. And if they can't get there, we go to January. Agreed, Eleanor said. She left Sandra's office at noon. She was walking toward the subway when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She answered because she had been answering numbers she didn't recognize for weeks now, because the world that was rearranging itself around her kept introducing itself from unexpected directions. Ms. Hayes, a man's voice, formal, slightly stiff, with the particular stiffness of someone who is not accustomed to making the kind of call they are currently making. My name is Richard Hale. I was a board member of Mercer Capital until this morning. Eleanor stopped walking. Until this morning. I resigned this morning, along with 2 other board members. He paused. I want to be clear that I'm not calling in any official capacity. I'm calling as someone who has been in rooms with your husband for a long time and who has realized in the past few weeks that I did not understand what I was in the room with. Mr. Hale, Eleanor kept her voice level. I need to be careful about what I can discuss. I have legal counsel. I'm not asking you to discuss anything. I'm not asking you for anything. His voice had the quality of a man who has made a difficult decision and is now on the other side of it in the particular open space that difficult decisions create. I just wanted you to know that the people who should have been paying attention weren't. And some of us are trying to correct that. A pause. Your grandmother, if she is the woman I think she is, based on what I've been reading, she built something extraordinary. I wanted you to know there are people in this city who understand that. Eleanor stood on the pavement in the November cold. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said. "Good luck, Miss Hayes." He hung up. She stood for another moment. Then she walked to the subway. She had things to do. That evening, Vivian called with news that changed the shape of everything. "Grant Mercer has been invited to speak at the Whitmore City Leadership Gala," she said the moment Eleanor answered. "Next Friday evening. He accepted 2 months ago. It's a significant event, 200 attendees major, press the kind of evening that defines public reputation." "I know the gala," Eleanor said. She had attended it twice on Grant's arm in the years when she was still the kind of wife who appeared at those events. "What about it?" His team has been quietly trying to manage the narrative around the board review and the investor letters. They've been telling the press that it's a routine review, that the trust claims are overstated, that everything is being handled responsibly. Vivian paused. At the gala, he is scheduled to speak about his vision for responsible urban development. He is being honored with the Whitmore Leadership Award. Eleanor sat very still. "Vivian." "Yes. Tell me what you're thinking." "I am thinking," Vivian said, "that certain notifications regarding the trust's formal ownership claims on properties that are very relevant to his public reputation have not yet been sent to the parties who need to receive them. The institutional investors who attended the gala as partners, the bank contacts who would be in that room, the board members who haven't yet resigned." She paused. "I have been waiting out of professional caution to ensure all documentation was absolutely complete before sending those notifications." "And is the documentation complete?" "It has been complete since Tuesday," Vivian said. "I have been holding it." Eleanor understood. She understood exactly what Vivian was holding, and why, and what sending it on a specific timeline would mean. "The gala is Friday," Eleanor said. "Yes. If those notifications go out Friday morning to the investors, the banks, the partners, those people will have that information when they walk into that room." "They will. And Grant won't know they have it until he's standing at the podium." A pause that contained everything. "Ms. Hayes," Vivian said carefully, "I want to be clear that any decision about timing is entirely yours. There is no legal requirement to send these notifications on any particular day. We can send them Monday. We can send them the following week. The legal effect is identical, regardless of timing." "But the human effect," Eleanor said quietly, "is not identical." "No," Vivian said, "it is not." Eleanor thought about the gala, the room full of people who had believed in Grant Mercer's vision of himself, the award, the speech about responsible urban development, the man who had called her not suitable standing at a podium being honored for building something that he had built on land he had never owned, using money that had been misrepresented to the very people who would be sitting in those chairs. She thought about the trash bag, about Tessa Vale in her cardigan, about the scrambled eggs at 8:45. She thought about her grandmother's letter. "Be careful, my darling. Be patient. And when the time comes, be extraordinary." "Send them Friday morning," Eleanor said. "First thing." Vivian was quiet for exactly 1 second. "First thing Friday morning," she said. "Yes." That week moved with a different quality than the weeks before it. Eleanor felt it a gathering, a compression, the way the air changes before something breaks. She kept her routine. Tea in the morning, notes, calls with Vivian and Sandra, dinners with Dina, a long phone call with her mother on Wednesday night in which Patricia Hayes said very little but listened very carefully, and at the end said simply, "Maggie would be so proud of you, Ellie. She already was, but she would be more." Eleanor had to put the phone down for a moment after that. Just a moment, then she picked it back up. "Thanks, Mom," she said, and she meant it in every direction the words could travel. Thursday, the day before the gala, Grant's attorneys requested an urgent meeting with Sandra. Sandra called Eleanor immediately afterward. "They came in with a completely different posture," Sandra said. "Callahan, the lead attorney, I've dealt with him for years. I have never seen him look the way he looked today. Like a man who has been informed that the building he's been working in is not the building he thought it was." "What did they offer?" "Full spousal support at a figure 3 times what their original counter proposed. Custody arrangement with no geographic restriction structured around your daughter's needs. A formal acknowledgement in the divorce record that the separation was initiated unilaterally by Grant. And," Sandra paused, "a request that the trust not pursue formal renegotiation of the property arrangements through litigation." Eleanor absorbed this. They're trying to buy peace on the property side through the divorce settlement. That's a reasonable reading. The property arrangements and the divorce are separate legal matters. Entirely separate. Yes. Anything I agree to in the divorce does not bind the trust. Correct. The trust is a separate legal entity. You as trustee are distinct from you as a divorcing spouse. Sandra's voice had the quality of someone being very precise on purpose. They may not fully understand that distinction, or they may be hoping you don't. I understand it, Eleanor said. I know you do. Tell them we'll consider their proposal on the divorce terms, Eleanor said. But make it clear, very clear, that any agreement on the divorce has no bearing whatsoever on the trust's legal position. Those are two separate conversations. I'll make it so clear, Sandra said, that there will be no possible confusion. Friday morning arrived. At 7:31, Vivian sent the notifications, 12 letters each addressed to a specific institutional partner, investor, or bank contact. Each one precise, documented, and completely irrefutably accurate in its description of the Hartwell Urban Trust's ownership position and the implications for their partnerships with Mercer Capital. At 8:04, Vivian texted Eleanor sent, all 12. Eleanor read it, set her phone down, made tea, sat at the window. At 9:16, Vivian called. I've received 2 responses already, both requesting urgent calls. These are senior partners at firms that have been in business with Mercer Capital for years. Her voice was steady, but carried that current again, the one that had been building since the Tuesday meeting when Callahan had stopped being dismissive. They are not calm. What are they saying? One of them used the phrase material misrepresentation. That is a very specific phrase with very specific legal implications, and the fact that he used it in an email rather than on the phone tells me he has already spoken to his own counsel. Material misrepresentation. Eleanor understood what that meant. Not a property dispute, not a civil negotiation, something with an entirely different set of consequences. Is Claire Sutton safe? Eleanor asked. It was the question she'd been carrying since the morning Claire had called her. She has retained her own attorney. She has been advised on her options. Whatever she decides to do, it will be her choice made with complete information. Vivian paused. She is safe. Good, Eleanor said, and meant it. The gala that night was held at the Whitmore Center, a building on Fifth Avenue that Eleanor happened to know because she had read every property on the schedule twice, was not directly owned by the Hartwell Trust. That had been important to her. She had not wanted the venue itself to be part of this. She had not wanted anyone to be physically displaced or embarrassed in their physical environment. The gala was just the room. The papers were the thing. She was not at the gala. She had never planned to be. She was at Dina's apartment on the sofa, with the cream and blue quilt pulled over her legs, her laptop on the cushion beside her, her phone in her hand, eating the soup Dina had made, and listening to the ordinary sounds of the city outside. She got the first call at 8:49, Sandra. His speech started at 8:30, Sandra said. She sounded not excited exactly, more like someone watching something they expected and still find remarkable. His attorney called me 6 minutes in. Grant apparently stopped. In the middle of a sentence. He had his phone in his jacket pocket and it buzzed and he looked at it and stopped. What had arrived? One of the investor notifications had been forwarded to him by a board contact who was in the room, the one that identified the Park Avenue building as trust property. Sandra paused. His attorney told me he read it at the podium, in front of 200 people. Eleanor set her soup down. Then, Sandra continued, apparently 3 other people in the room received the same notification simultaneously because they were on the same investor distribution list and their phones lit up at the same time. And it sort of rippled, the way things ripple in a room when something has shifted, but no one is saying it yet. Eleanor sat very still. He tried to continue the speech, Sandra said. He got through another paragraph. Then a senior partner from Meridian Bank, one of his biggest lenders, stood up and quietly left the room. And then 2 board members left. And then the Whitmore Foundation director leaned over and said something to the event coordinator. And the coordinator went up to the podium and said there would be a brief recess. And Grant? Eleanor asked. His attorney says he walked off the stage and straight to the back corridor. He has not spoken to press. His publicist has issued a statement saying he is unavailable for comment due to a family matter. Sandra's voice was careful, precise. The award was not presented. Eleanor sat with her phone against her ear in Dina's apartment and let that settle. The Whitmore Leadership Award, the speech about responsible urban development, the vision for the future, all of it waiting at the end of a podium he could no longer stand at. "Eleanor," Sandra said more gently, "are you okay?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and because Sandra deserved the truth, "I didn't expect to feel anything. I thought I'd moved past feeling things about him, but this—" She stopped. "This is still the end of something," Sandra said quietly. "Even when it had to end, it's still the end." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." She sat with that for a moment. Her hand found her stomach. Her daughter was still. Peaceful for once, that deep, settled stillness that the doctors said meant a baby was in its best sleep. "Sleep through this one, sweetheart," Eleanor said quietly, not to Sandra, to herself, to the small person inside her who would someday ask what this time had been and would deserve an honest answer. "It's almost over." But it wasn't quite over yet. At 9:47, Tessa Vale posted one final time from the penthouse. It was a photograph of the city at night through the floor-to-ceiling window. No caption, just a location tag home. 48 seconds later, she deleted it. But Eleanor's sister Rachel, who had been monitoring Tessa's account with the focused attention of a documentary filmmaker who knows footage when she sees it, had screenshotted it in the gap between post and deletion. She texted it to Eleanor at 9:48 with the message, "She knows." She deleted it. Eleanor looked at the screenshot. The familiar view, the city lights, the word home in small white letters over the image before Tessa had thought better of claiming it. She forwarded it to Vivian with a single line. She deleted this 48 seconds after posting. "Does that change anything?" Vivian responded in 3 minutes. "It changes nothing legally. We have her full posting history. Timestamps location data. Deletion is irrelevant once documented. But it tells us something useful about where her head is." Eleanor put her phone down. Dina came in from the kitchen and looked at her. "Is it done?" Dina said. Eleanor thought about the letters in 12 inboxes, the phones lighting up across a ballroom, a man stopping mid-sentence at a podium because the ground beneath his empire had finally become visible for what it always was. A young woman deleting a photograph of a home she had never owned in a building that had never been offered to her by anyone with the authority to offer it. "The night is done," Eleanor said. "The rest takes a little longer." Dina sat down beside her. She didn't say anything. She just sat there the way old friends do, the way people who have known each other long enough to understand that some moments don't need narration, just need company. Outside, the city moved through its Friday night. 200 people at a gala were having conversations that would be different than the conversations they'd expected to have. 12 investors were rereading letters with new eyes. Grant Mercer was in a back corridor somewhere talking to lawyers, facing the weight of a narrative that had collapsed around him, with the quiet efficiency of something that had always been true. And Eleanor Hayes was on a sofa in a small apartment above a coffee shop, 8 months pregnant, hand on her stomach, watching the city through a window that didn't belong to her, but the rest of it did. The rest of it was entirely, irrevocably hers. The weekend after the gala was the quietest Eleanor had felt in years. Not empty quiet. Full quiet, the kind that comes after something enormous has passed through and left the air changed. She slept 9 hours on Friday night, which she hadn't done in months. Her daughter slept too, or at least was still in that deep, settled way that felt like sleep. And Eleanor woke on Saturday morning with the particular clarity of someone whose body has decided without consulting them that the emergency is over and rest is now permitted. Dina made breakfast. Real breakfast. Eggs, toast, sliced fruit. The good coffee that she kept for special occasions in a tin at the back of the cabinet. She set it on the table without ceremony and sat across from Eleanor and poured herself a cup and said nothing for a long time. Finally, Dina said, "What happens now?" Eleanor wrapped both hands around her mug. "Now the slow part," she said. "The part that doesn't have a dramatic moment. Just work." "Are you ready for that?" "I've been doing the slow work my whole life," Eleanor said. "I'm very good at it." Vivian called at 9 that morning. She sounded for the first time since Eleanor had known her, which was only 6 weeks, though it felt like far longer the way significant relationships compress time, something close to satisfied. "The press coverage is beginning," Vivian said. 3 financial publications ran pieces this morning about the board review at Mercer Capital. They don't have the full picture yet. They don't know about the trust specifically, but the investor withdrawals are public record, and journalists are very good at following money when it starts moving in unexpected directions. How long before they find the trust? Someone will connect it within the week, possibly sooner. A pause. I want to make sure you're prepared for that. When it becomes public that the Hartwell Urban Trust is owned by a woman who was handed a trash bag by the man who was unknowingly renting from her grandmother, that is a story that will travel very far, very fast. Eleanor had thought about this, had been thinking about it since the night she'd first read the trust documents in Dina's apartment. The public version. The story as other people would tell it. I want to control how it's told, she said. Not suppress it, just tell it accurately, on my terms, when I'm ready. I have a contact at a journalist I trust completely, Vivian said. When you're ready. After the baby, Eleanor said. After the divorce is finalized. After I've had at least 2 weeks where nothing urgent is happening. She paused. So sometime in the next decade, possibly. Vivian made a sound that was Eleanor was almost certain a laugh. Brief and precise and quickly contained, but unmistakably a laugh. She had never heard Vivian laugh before. After the baby, Vivian agreed. The divorce settlement meeting happened on a Tuesday, 12 days after the gala in Sandra's conference room. Eleanor sat on one side of the table with Sandra. Grant's attorney Callahan sat on the other side. Grant himself was not present, which Eleanor had requested through Sandra, and which Callahan had agreed to with the speed of someone who understood that his client's presence would not improve anything. The meeting took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Eleanor sat through all of it with her hands folded on the table. Her face composed, her voice level, every time Sandra deferred to her for confirmation. She said yes to the support figure, which was substantial. She said yes to the custody framework, which gave her primary residence with generous and flexible access for grants structured entirely around Beatrice. She'd already decided on the name, had known it for weeks, and her well-being. She said yes to the formal record notation that the separation had been initiated unilaterally. Then Callahan, in the careful tone of a man who has been told to ask, but knows the answer is unlikely to be yes, said, and regarding the trust's position on the property arrangements, is there any flexibility on the timeline for formal renegotiation? Eleanor looked at him directly. The trust's position, she said, is managed by me in my capacity as trustee, which is entirely separate from my capacity as a party to this divorce. Those are 2 different chairs. I'm sitting in one of them today. She paused. If Mercer Capital wishes to discuss commercial renegotiation of the property arrangements, they can contact Vivian Cross. Her firm's standard rates apply. Callahan looked at his notepad. He wrote something. He did not ask again. At 4:17 that afternoon, Eleanor Hayes signed the divorce settlement documents. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel devastated. She felt accurate, like a record that had been wrong for a long time had finally been corrected, and the relief was not in the correction itself, but in the simple fact of the truth being on paper where it belonged. Sandra walked her out afterward. In the lobby, she stopped and turned to Eleanor and held out her hand. It has been, Sandra said with the precise warmth of a woman who does not use words carelessly, one of the most extraordinary cases I've had in 20 years. Eleanor shook her hand. Thank you for not letting me settle for less. You never would have, Sandra said simply. You knew exactly what you wanted from the first day. I just helped you say it in the right language. Eleanor stepped out into the December air. Cold now, sharp the city decorated, and loud with the particular energy of the holiday season. She stood on the pavement and breathed it in. Her daughter moved a long, slow roll, that familiar planet-adjusting orbit feeling, and Eleanor put her hand on her stomach and laughed. Actually laughed out loud on the sidewalk, not caring who heard. Almost time, she told her. Almost. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, Beatrice Margaret Hayes was born. She arrived at 6:42 in the morning after 14 hours of labor that Eleanor endured with the same focused, deliberate patience she had brought to everything over the past 2 months. Dina was in the waiting room. Rachel was in the room holding Eleanor's hand through the hard parts with the grip of someone who had been told she could leave and had absolutely refused to. When it was over and Beatrice was placed in Eleanor's arms, small and red-faced and furiously indignant about having arrived as if she found the whole situation logistically inconvenient, Eleanor looked at her daughter's face and felt something move through her chest that had no name in any language she'd ever learned. Not joy exactly, larger than joy, more structural, the feeling of something foundational sliding into place. "Hi," Eleanor said. Her voice was destroyed from 14 hours of labor, and she didn't care at all. "Hi, Beatrice. I'm your mother. I've been waiting to tell you things." Rachel from the corner made a sound that was attempting to be quiet and was not succeeding. "Aunt Rachel is also here," Eleanor said to Beatrice. "She's going to teach you about documentary filmmaking, whether you want to learn or not. I'm sorry in advance." "I'm not sorry at all," Rachel said, through what were very clearly tears she was absolutely not admitting to. Dina was allowed in 20 minutes later. She stood at the edge of the room and looked at Beatrice in Eleanor's arms and said very quietly, "Oh, Ellie." Just that. And Eleanor understood everything it meant. Her mother arrived that afternoon from Westchester, walked into the room, sat beside Eleanor's bed, looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, and then looked at Eleanor with an expression that was 60 years of maternal love organized into a single look. "She has Maggie's forehead," Patricia said. Eleanor looked at her daughter's face. She thought about that. "You think so?" "Exactly. That particular..." Patricia touched her own forehead lightly. "She's going to be stubborn." "Good," Eleanor said. "She's going to need to be." Grant sent a formal message through his attorney requesting visitation access per the custody agreement. Eleanor relayed through Sandra that the agreement terms would be honored. She felt nothing particular about it. Not anger, not grief. Just the administrative steadiness of someone managing a situation, according to a document they had signed with clear eyes. He would be part of Beatrice's life because Beatrice deserved to know where she came from. What she made of that knowledge would be hers to decide when she was old enough to decide anything. The weeks that followed were the slow work Eleanor had promised Dina. Not undramatic, nothing that involved Vivian Cross as your attorney was ever entirely undramatic, but slower, steadier, the rhythm of rebuilding rather than surviving. The formal renegotiation of Mercer Capital's property arrangements began in January. Callahan's firm was across the table from Vivian's, and this time there was no dismissiveness, no suggestion that the trust's claims were overstated. There was only the quiet, thorough work of two legal teams establishing accurate commercial terms for arrangements that had operated on informality and assumption for decades. The numbers were not small. The new commercial lease rates for the Park Avenue headquarters, the residential tower, the 3 East Side properties, all of them recalibrated to accurate market value, for the first time represented a significant restructuring of Mercer Capital's operating costs. Grant's finance team would be working those numbers for months. It was not Eleanor had decided her concern. She had not set out to destroy him. She had set out to be accurate. The trust's properties would be managed correctly at fair market rates, as her grandmother had always intended. What that meant for the man who had been benefiting from her grandmother's informal generosity for years, that was a consequence of reality, not a punishment she'd designed. She told Vivian this directly in their January meeting, and Vivian had looked at her for a moment and said, "Your grandmother said something similar once, about another matter entirely. She said accurate is the only permanent standard. Everything else is temporary." "Did she talk about me?" Eleanor asked. She hadn't meant to ask it. It came out from somewhere beneath strategy, beneath legal positioning, from the place where a granddaughter simply misses her grandmother. Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different than it ever had been, softer, with the particular quality of someone sharing something they've held carefully for a long time. "She talked about you often," Vivian said, "in the last year especially. She told me you were brilliant, and that you'd made choices she didn't always understand, but that she trusted completely. She said..." Vivian paused, and something moved in her face, a brief private thing. "She said you were the kind of person who needed to find things out for yourself, that telling you would have robbed you of something." Another pause. "She said she was sorry she couldn't be there when you opened the envelope. That was the one thing she was sorry about." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. "She was there," she said finally, "in the way that matters." Vivian nodded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Claire Sutton made her decision in February. She filed a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, supported by documentation she had retained during her time at Mercer Capital, and supplemented by the independent findings of the board review, which had concluded in January, with results that Mercer Capital's press team described as mixed, and that every financial journalist in the city described as damning. Eleanor was not involved in Claire's decision. She had never asked her to file, never suggested a timeline, never applied any pressure in any direction. She had given her Vivian's name and told her to make the choice with complete information. That was all. When Sandra called to tell her about the filing, Eleanor said, "Is she protected?" "She has excellent counsel, yes." "Good." A pause. "That's all I wanted to know." The SEC investigation was news. Not front-page news immediately, but the kind of story that builds, that starts in financial publications and migrates to general press, and eventually arrives at the place where people who don't follow financial news are talking about it over dinner. And when it arrived at that place, someone Eleanor never found out who connected the Hartwell Urban Trust to Eleanor Hayes. And then the story became something different, something larger. A journalist at a publication Eleanor trusted, the one Vivian had mentioned months ago, called to request an interview. Eleanor called Vivian. "Is it time?" "It's time," Vivian said. "Beatrice is 3 months old. The divorce is finalized. The renegotiations are documented. The SEC matter is public record." A pause. "And honestly, you should tell your own story before someone tells it for you." "I've been telling my own story my whole life," Eleanor said. "I just haven't had an audience." The interview was published on a Thursday morning in March, 4.5 months after a man had handed his pregnant wife a black trash bag and told her to pack only what she'd earned. Eleanor had been careful about what she said and how she said it. She had not performed victimhood. She had not performed triumph. She had spoken accurately about a marriage that had cost her things she hadn't fully accounted for, about a grandmother who had built something extraordinary and quiet, about the difference between the kind of power that announces itself and the kind that simply exists waiting to be claimed. The piece ran with a single photograph Eleanor at the window of the office she had just established at the Hartwell Trust's new management headquarters, a building on Madison Avenue Trust property, long underutilized, now renovated and alive with Beatrice in her arms, looking out at the city. Not looking at the camera, looking out. The response was she had not expected it to be what it was. By noon on the Thursday, the piece ran. Her email had filled with messages from women she had never met. Not all of them had the same story. Some were older, some younger, some had lost marriages, some had lost jobs, some had lost things harder to name, the quiet erosion of years spent being infrastructure for someone else's vision. But they all had the quality of people writing to someone who had said something they recognized. One message arrived at 4:17 that afternoon from a woman named Margaret, 73 years old, who wrote, "I was handed a similar bag 30 years ago. I didn't have what you had. But reading your story reminded me that I had more than I knew. I just hadn't counted it correctly." Eleanor read that one 3 times. Then she wrote back, not a form response, a real one. 4 sentences that she meant in all 4 directions. The Hartwell Urban Trust, under Eleanor's management, began its transformation that spring. She had thought carefully about what her grandmother had built and what she wanted to build from it. Not the same thing. Something that grew from the same roots but reached toward different light. The first initiative was housing. 3 underutilized Hartwell properties on the west side, long-term commercial leases that had expired spaces that had been sitting in transition, were converted into supported housing for women leaving difficult domestic situations. Not charity exactly. Structure. Stability. A place to stand while you figure out what comes next. She worked with a nonprofit that had been doing this work for years and had always struggled for physical space. Eleanor gave them the space, long-term leases at rates that reflected partnership rather than profit. The nonprofit director, a woman named Josephine, who had done this work for 22 years with insufficient resources, sat across from Eleanor at the first meeting and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. "Why this?" she asked. "You could do anything with these properties." Eleanor thought about the right answer, about the trash bag, about the lobby with the suited men, about standing on the sidewalk outside a building with an eviction notice in her hands and her daughter not yet born and the city moving around her with complete indifference. "Because I know what it means," she said, "to be standing outside a door with nothing and to need someone to open it." She paused. "And I know what it means to discover the door was always yours." Josephine looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up her pen and got to work. The second initiative was legal. Two of the trust's unused commercial spaces in different neighborhoods were converted into legal aid offices, staffed through partnerships with 3 law schools whose clinical programs had been looking for exactly this kind of placement. Women who could not afford the Sandra Oseys of the world, and most women couldn't now, had somewhere to go. Sandra herself consulted on the structural design of the program. Gratis. Eleanor had tried to discuss payment, and Sandra had held up one hand and said, "Consider it professional development," and that had been the end of that conversation. The third initiative was the one that mattered most to Eleanor personally, because it came from the part of the story that wasn't dramatic, the part that didn't have a gala or a letter or a revelation. It came from the quiet part, the part about the 6 years. It was a documentation program, simple in concept, for women in domestic partnerships, married or otherwise, who had sacrificed career or educational opportunities as part of the relationship. The program provided free financial counseling and what Eleanor had come to call accurate accounting. Not legal advice, not divorce preparation, just an accurate record, what you contributed, what it was worth, what you are owed by the simple mathematics of time and labor, and the choices you made in good faith. Vivian had looked at the proposal with the particular expression of someone who is choosing between saying something professional and something true, and is deciding on true. "Your grandmother," Vivian said finally, "tried to do something like this once, in the 70s. She couldn't get it off the ground. Wrong moment." She looked at Eleanor. "This is the right moment." "That's what she was waiting for," Eleanor said. "I think that's why she waited." "Yes," Vivian said quietly, "I think that's exactly right." On a Friday evening in May, 8 months after the trash bag, Eleanor stood at a podium at a community summit hosted at the Hartwell Trust's Madison Avenue headquarters. The room held about 150 people, not the Whitmore Gala, not the glittering assembly of financial power that Grant had expected to be honored in front of. Nonprofit directors, legal aid attorneys, social workers. A dozen women who had gone through the housing program and come out the other side and wanted to be in the room where the next chapter was being discussed. Beatrice was in the front row in a carrier on Dina's chest, awake, and looking around at the room with the serious evaluating expression of a 5-month-old who finds the world mostly interesting and occasionally suspicious. Rachel was 2 rows back with her camera, because of course she was. Patricia Hayes sat beside Rachel, upright and attentive, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time to see something, and is not going to miss a moment of it now that it's here. Eleanor stood at the podium and looked at the room. She had prepared remarks. She'd spent 2 evenings writing them, editing them, making sure every word was accurate, which was the only standard she'd been working to since October. She knew what she wanted to say. She looked at the room. She looked at Beatrice in the front row, that small, serious face taking in the world. She looked at Dina, who caught her eye and gave her the particular look that meant, "I'm here. Go ahead. I've got her." She set her prepared remarks to the side. "A door," she said, "can either trap a woman or save her life. The only difference is who holds the key." The room was quiet. I spent 6 years in a life that looked from the outside exactly like what it was supposed to look like, and from the inside, it was infrastructure. It was invisible labor, an erased ambition, and a graduate program I left at Columbia because someone I loved said he needed me somewhere else. It was breakfast made and calendars managed, and social events navigated, and a version of myself made smaller year by year until she was very quiet. She paused. "I thought quiet was the same as gone. It isn't. I want you to know that. Quiet is not gone." Someone in the third row was nodding. Someone in the back had pressed a hand to their mouth. "My grandmother built something extraordinary," Eleanor continued. "She built it quietly for 60 years, and she kept it waiting for me. Not because she thought I needed rescuing, but because she understood the way some women understand the women who have been paying attention for a very long time, that power lands differently in hands that have had to survive something first." She looked out at the room. She waited until I needed it, because she knew that a woman who has stood outside a door with nothing understands what a door means, what security means, what dignity means, in ways that can't be taught, only lived. The room was very still. "I am not standing here because I was lucky. I am standing here because my grandmother was patient, and because I was stubborn, and because 6 weeks of very good lawyers helped." A small ripple of laughter moved through the room. "But mostly, I am standing here because of something my grandmother understood that I want every woman in this room to understand." She paused. "You were never abandoned," she said. "You were simply standing in a life that had not yet revealed its power." Beatrice in the front row chose this exact moment to make a sound, a small, emphatic 5-month-old sound that fell somewhere between agreement and commentary. The room laughed, real laughter, warm and sudden and human. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Beatrice looked back with those serious eyes, that evaluating gaze, that expression that was already 5 months in, so recognizably her own. "Yeah," Eleanor said softly, just for her. "I know." She gathered her notes. She looked out at the room one last time at Josephine from the housing nonprofit, at the law students who had given their Saturdays to the legal aid office, at the women who had stood outside doors themselves and found their way through, at her mother in the second row with her chin up and her eyes bright, at Dina holding Beatrice with the careful competence of a woman who loves someone else's child like her own. She thought about October, about the lobby, about the navy envelope in her coat pocket, about tea going cold twice in a coffee shop, while a woman named Vivian Cross arrived 3 minutes early and changed everything. She thought about her grandmother writing 3 pages in precise slanted cursive on cream stationery, the words forming in whatever order truth arrives. "Not until you need it, Ellie. You'll know when." She had known. She stepped back from the podium. The room began to applaud, not the polite applause of ceremony, but the real kind. The kind that starts before people plan to start it. The kind that means something was said that needed saying. And Eleanor stood there for a moment, her hand at her side, not performing humility and not performing triumph, just standing in it. In the room, in the moment, in the life that had finally fully come into its power. She was not the woman who had been handed a trash bag. She was not the woman who had been called not suitable, not visible, not valuable enough for the future someone else was building. She was Eleanor Margaret Hayes, controlling trustee of the Hartwell Urban Trust, mother of Beatrice, granddaughter of Maggie Keeper, of a door that had always been hers. And she had never, not for a single moment, been abandoned. She had simply been standing in a life that was waiting for her to claim it. And now, standing in the room her grandmother's patience had built for her with her daughter's eyes on her face, and the city spread beyond the windows like something she was only beginning to understand. She owned, she had.